And certainly not my staff. But so good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, council. Good afternoon, everyone in the audience. And welcome to the first meeting of New York's Climate Action Council. I'm Jared Snyder, Deputy Commissioner here at DEC. And before the meeting gets started, I'd just like to set a couple ground rules, set the stage for the meeting. First of all, this is an open meeting, and we are glad to have the audience here to observe. Now, unfortunately, there was more interest in attending this meeting than we could accommodate in this room, so many people have to be in a satellite room. We apologize that we couldn't fit everybody in this room, but we certainly value everyone's attendance. This is not a public hearing. It's an open meeting, but it's not a public hearing, so we will not be taking any comments or questions from the audience. We will have a public engagement process as part of this important effort, and the stakeholder engagement, the engagement with the public is very important. That will follow. Let me see. The microphones, I just want to say, everybody around the table, the microphones are live. I'm told they're very sensitive, so just beware of that when whispering to people sitting next to you. Another thing, everybody has a DEC glass in front of you. You're welcome to take those home with you as I guess sort of a souvenir of today's meeting.
For a nominal fee.
So there's doors in the back of the room for people in the audience to come and go. A door on the side here, which is more for the people sitting up at the front here in the council. Restrooms are outside through the elevator banks. You got to go through past security, past the elevator bank, and they're on the right side. So I think that's all I have to sort of set the stage. Let me turn the meeting over now to the co-chairs, Basil Segos, the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation, my boss, and Alicia Barton, the President of New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Alicia, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. Well, let me see. Is the mic working in the back? Do I need it? Okay. Good. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Alicia Barton. I am President and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, and it's my honor to serve as co-chair of the Climate Action Council. First and foremost, I want to start by addressing the council, and on behalf of Basil and myself as co-chairs, thank you. Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for your service. The role of this council is critically important to the future of our state, and so personally speaking, I could say it's both an honor and a serious responsibility that I feel in kicking off our work today. And we have a very serious mission ahead of us, but I've no doubt that we are collectively up to the task, and it's with a lot of pride and enthusiasm that we officially kick off these proceedings today. Governor Cuomo has made clear, and frankly the science is crystal clear, that climate change is an existential threat to our way of life, and that we must act boldly in order to rise to the challenge. Of the dozens of proposals in the governor's 2020 agenda, he has stated that tackling climate change rises to the top in terms of urgency and impact that we need to see in the years ahead to protect New York State. New York has already experienced devastating impacts from climate change in recent years, and unfortunately it's inevitable that really every single community in New York will ultimately be touched by climate change in one way or another. But we're proud to be here today with all of you and to say clearly and collectively that this is not a threat that New York will give into. Under Governor Cuomo, New York is already leading when it comes to clean energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And last year, the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was nothing short of a watershed moment for our state, turning the tide on climate change and stepping up to what I believe is our generational responsibility to act boldly and to act urgently. With the Climate Act, New York is also stepping up to national and global leadership. This act really is a high watermark for the level of ambition that has been put in place by really any major global economy when it comes to clearly stepping forward and undertaking the hard work it will take in order to combat climate change. It's setting us on a new path, along with a handful of other leading states and countries, to create a different future from the one that we will experience if we don't act soon. And look, we know it won't be easy. There's going to be hard work ahead, hard choices ahead, and there isn't any precedent for what we are seeking to do together. There's not a playbook you can take off the shelf for how to decarbonize the world's 13th largest economy in just 3 decades, but that's the work that this council will participate in. Literally, we will be writing the playbook for what it will take in order to put our state on a more sustainable and more prosperous path in the years ahead. To be successful, we'll need to think differently. We'll need to embrace the imperative for change, and we will need to reach New Yorkers in every region, every age, every demographic, every political affiliation, and we particularly will need to reach and to seek to benefit those who have been left behind and unfairly burdened by our energy decisions in the past. We know the stakes are high and that the world will be watching what New York does and the work that we will all do together. But as New Yorkers, I think we can all say that's an opportunity we welcome. This is what New York has historically done. This is what New York does best. New York launched the modern environmental movement at Storm King Mountain in the 1960s, and we believe that now in the 2020s, we will work together to pioneer a new path for New York State towards a carbon neutral economy. To embark on that path, we're fortunate to have a diverse and highly qualified roster of council members, and again, thank you all for being here, for volunteering your time and your expertise and all the experiences you bring with you to help us work together to get the job done. It may go without saying, but developing a collaborative spirit amongst this group and working together will be a critical element to our success. And so, I personally look forward to working with each and every one of you, and I imagine I can speak confidently on behalf of my co-chair in saying the same. So, the hard work does lie ahead, but I'm confident we're up to the challenge, and I look forward to working with you in that capacity and to really accomplishing something truly significant for our state, for our communities, and frankly for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. My name is Basil Sagos. I'm DEC Commissioner, co-chair of this wonderful council, and extraordinarily honored to be with you all today. I'll second everything that Alicia said. We are facing an existential threat. There's no doubt about it. I've been with the state for 8 years and have seen changes since then that personally, for me, make me feel like this is the most important work that I'll do in my career. Certainly that many of us will approach this task today and hopefully meet it over the next 2 years. This may be the most consequential work that any of us do. When we talk about addressing what is this existential crisis. The governor has clearly articulated an intent to us, both on this council and outside this council, to do this really important work, leading off the state of the state and the budget addresses with passion and direction towards this existential problem, and we feel it. We certainly feel it, and we understand that this is the task ahead. I want to thank you all for serving. This is quite a group. Some real firepower in this room. Dr. Zucker just stepped out. He's in the middle of the COVID-19 response now that is a worldwide situation. To have him obviously serving in this capacity here at the same time is quite impressive. So I say, if this is, as the New York Times called it, the most ambitious climate law of any developed nation or sub-nation or state, then we on the council need to approach it with that same level of ambition. This is clearly we have an opportunity to move aggressively, smartly, and focus on actions. Right? We've had many, many years of talk and recognizing this issue, and I think the task ahead of us is very clear right now. We need to chart a path forward for New York State. And we need to be smart about it. We need to be smart about how we communicate to the public, how we articulate our objectives to the public, because ultimately we are here representing 20 million people. One state out of 50, but a very influential state, and all states will be watching what we do, and nations that are aspiring to the same level of action on climate. We have an opportunity to demonstrate to them what climate action truly looks like. So I ask all of you to approach this council with a sense of all of us being equals. We all have diverse backgrounds. We all have incredible skills and talents. But we really have one mission right now, which is to find a way out of this mess that we are in as a globe, and what New York's role will be in it. And certainly will present challenges for us. As Alicia said, there are seemingly insurmountable hurdles ahead of us, but also truly exciting opportunities for New York as we begin to re-envision the way the state looks and feels. How we protect the state for the long term. We're not talking about just protecting the state's environment. We're talking about protecting the state's economy, its way of life. And again, we are one of many states, but I truly believe that since New York has many decades of being on the vanguard of action on the environment or any issue, that we have an opportunity now to truly lead on this in the absence of any real leadership at the federal level. So I'm looking forward to this. I'll be frank, this is very exciting and inspiring to be with you all here today. This is going to be a marathon with a series of very intense sprints, and my intent is to make sure that we start sprinting right out of the box today. So I have the coin flip honor of being chair of this meeting today. The coin will then flip to Alicia, the next meeting. So I'll run the meeting today as it goes, and we'll have a spirited discussion, hopefully, and then get you back to your loved ones and get Dr. Zucker back to COVID-19 as soon as humanly possible. So thank you all. Okay, so we're going to go, I'll detail briefly today's agenda. We're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Radley Horton. Thank you, Doctor, for being here today. We'll then talk about the Climate Act requirements. Of course, many of you are familiar with the Climate Act, but we're going to walk through it again, discussing the roles and responsibilities, the Climate Action Council, the objectives on achieving climate justice, talking about the climate action goals. We'll have a discussion about the bylaws, in other words, how we govern ourselves as a body. And then the all-important issue of the advisory panels, and then wrap up with a sense as to where we're going next with the next meetings. So I'll introduce Dr. Radley Horton. Dr. Radley Horton is a Lamont Associate Research Professor at Columbia's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. His research focuses on extreme climates, tail risks, climate impacts, and adaptation. Dr. Radley was a convening lead author for the 3rd National Climate Assessment and currently leads Columbia's Adaptation Initiative, the Columbia University's WWF Advanced Partnership, the NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments funded Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, and the Department of the Interior funded Northeast Climate Science Center. He serves on numerous national and international task forces and committees, including the Climate Scenarios Task Force in support of the 2018 National Climate Assessment, and he teaches in Columbia University's Sustainable Development Department. Dr. Horton.
Thank you all. Is that on? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
There's a button that takes it off mute. I see. Thank you. Yeah, okay. There we go. Thank you. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have the chance to speak with you all briefly today. As a climate scientist, I find myself more and more in situations where I'm talking about potential tipping points in the climate system. We'll get into that a little bit. our fear as scientists that some of the climate changes are happening faster than we thought, that maybe our models that we'll talk about have missed or underestimated some key processes. That's obviously a pessimistic message. Similarly, when we look at a lot of human ecological systems, I think we're starting to see some signs that they may be more sensitive to a given amount of warming, a given amount of climate change than we used to think. Another very pessimistic and concerning message. So what I mention this about here is because this is really a special opportunity here, I think, and a very special experience for me to be able to speak, because in order to continue to be optimistic, I have to also be able to point in presentations to positive tipping points, in a sense. The societal response, the potential to potentially mobilize private sector, government, the public, to lead and bend the curve on our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think as we're here today, thinking about the ambition of what's being discussed, combined with the heft and the ability to actually implement at scale, I really believe this is a very unique opportunity, and so I'm very appreciative of the chance to sort of quickly provide a little background context. So as a climate scientist, I have to, just over a couple slides, tell us a little bit about some of the evidence of climate change, how we know human activities are the primary driver. But then we're going to quickly get into talking about extreme weather events as the primary source of vulnerability, where we need to adapt, and really, I think, the sort of societal pivot to get us to move quickly towards solutions. We'll start at a global scale. We'll look quickly at some impacts in New York State as well, and just quickly spell out why it's so urgent that we reduce our emissions dramatically in this time. We should have time for a little bit of questions. Okay, so first slide. What you're looking at here is surface temperatures, lower atmosphere, a trend from 1900 through 2012. Anywhere you see purple colors, that's as much as 4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming since 1900. Where you see white, that just means there isn't enough data to calculate a 113-year trend, especially for the first half of the 20th century over a lot of the tropical oceans, even some of the land masses. We didn't have good enough data to enable us to calculate a long-term trend. There are only a couple spots on that map where there's actually been a downward trend. There's one location you might see south of Greenland in the North Atlantic Ocean, and then a couple of dots over the southeast United States. The downward trends that I just mentioned, shown in blue, are an order of magnitude smaller than the warming trends at their most extreme, those purple colors. So the few places you see cooling, it's on the order of half a degree. I bring this up just to show that the statistics have already shifted. You can still find individual years, individual locations where you might not have a powerful upward trend. But as we're thinking about the infrastructure for the future, as we're thinking about what we're adapted to, already the statistics have shifted. That's going to be a takeaway of this presentation. And then a seemingly disparate piece of information, what do we know about carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere? Well, here we can look back to 800,000 years ago using proxies, and especially things like little bubbles in ancient ice cores. And we can see that over this long time scale, can everybody hear me all right? Okay. Carbon dioxide concentrations were essentially varying between maybe upwards of 280 parts per million tops over that period, and at times lower than 180 parts per million. And look what happened since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. We expand out the x-axis there. We've seen a 45% increase in carbon dioxide concentrations since the Industrial Revolution. Well over 400 parts per million right now. And we can actually look at the chemical signature of that carbon dioxide, and we can see that it's from fossils. It's from the burning of ancient coal, oil, and gas. That's the primary driver, along with land use changes. If we had more time, we could get into the fact that these aren't just two separate lines of evidence: surface temperatures, carbon dioxide concentrations. The basic physics of why those greenhouse gases should warm the atmosphere, essentially a one-way blanket, have been understood for 100 or 200 years, trivially simple, although there are key science questions about feedbacks within the system. We could also talk about how it's not just warming of the lower atmosphere, it's warming of the upper oceans. It's more water vapor in the atmosphere, giving us more powerful storms. It's changes in the ice cover. It's changes in the temperature of the land itself. It's changes in phenology, the onset of spring, end of fall. Powerful signals have already emerged. But that's the quick Climate Science 101. Now let's shift into a discussion of extreme events, because this is what really matters most for society. So starting with just a basic schematic, hopefully that's a pointer, yeah. Okay, so here we have days per year. Let's just think of Albany's days in a given year. Some are really cold. Temperatures might drop below -15 occasionally. Every once in a while they go above 100. And this is the probability or the number of days per year or per 30 years within a certain temperature band. So before we alter the climate, we might have this first sort of normal distribution. A lot of days that are 40, 50, 60 degrees, relatively few that are 15 below or 98 Fahrenheit or so. Takeaway here is just a small shift in the average conditions with climate change, just nudging that whole distribution upwards by a few degrees. Has very little effect on the number of 50 or 60 degree days from a percentage standpoint, but it has a huge impact out at these tails where we're so vulnerable, where it's so difficult to provide energy, electricity to people when they most desperately need it, when those temperatures get really hot and our vulnerable populations suffer. With just a little bit of warming, we can see a big increase in the number of days above, say, 98, and we start to experience these previously unprecedented 102, 103, 104 degree days. So there are real nonlinearities, both in terms of frequency and intensity of these rare extremes, but then also on the societal impacts, ecological impacts that are associated with those changes. All right, so that's just a schematic. Let's actually look at some real data. This is showing you the entire US, about 1,800 weather stations, individual years going back to 1930. What you're seeing is how many record-breaking high temperatures were experienced relative to how many record-breaking low temperatures across those 1,800 stations every single day in a given year. So where you see blue, those are years that had more record-breaking low temperatures than record-breaking high temperatures. So there's a lot of variability in this chart. Even since 2000, you can have individual years that had more, across the whole US, more record-breaking lows than record-breaking highs. But clearly the statistics have already shifted. With 1 degree Celsius of global warming, less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we have years now that have 7 times as many record-breaking high temperatures as record-breaking lows. That's what we've seen already with 1 degree Celsius of global warming, less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's big sensitivity in the extremes to just small shifts in average. We can see the exact same thing when we look at sea level rise. You might have heard that globally we've only had about 8 inches of sea level rise since 1900. Sounds like nothing, right? A place like New York City might have a normal 4-foot tidal cycle between low and high tide. How could 8 inches of sea level rise matter? And as we go out into the future, I'll just quickly note that we could potentially see anywhere by the end of the century between, as a best case scenario, maybe 2 feet. Our work with NYSERDA in New York City in the past, we had capped that at about 2 meters as a worst case scenario by 2100. We can't totally rule out even higher numbers now. They're low probability, but potentially very high consequence. But I'm not going to talk to you about any of these low probability, high consequence scenarios. I'm giving you the best case scenario, showing you how much extreme events change with just continuation, essentially, of historical trends. So I mentioned, actually in New York it's been about 1 foot of sea level rise, but across globally more like 8 inches over the last century. Let's look at what that means for coastal flooding. This is, I know, sort of a complicated slide, but I'm going to spend a couple minutes on it because I think it's very important. The overall takeaways are that we're already getting far more frequent coastal flooding events than we used to with just that little bit of sea level rise. And when we have catastrophic storms, the Sandy type events, the water's going far further inland. It's much deeper, causing more damage, causing more risk of loss of life. The water's moving faster, and waves are moving further inland. So how do we see this in these figures? First, let's look at the figure on the left. This is showing you not just New York, but all across US coastlines on this axis. Over the last 2 generations, since 1950, as we move forward through time, how many days per year, shown in this axis and also as colors, red means a lot, blue means a few, What's been happening as we move through time in the frequency of what are called nuisance flooding events. These are the days when the sun's out, there's no storm around, but if you live in a low-lying area, maybe you can't get home by your normal coastal route. Maybe you have water in your basement. Maybe you can't open for business. If these are relatively rare events, you can manage. They're not catastrophic. But across the U.S., some locations are now seeing these events 5 or 10 times more often than they did just 2 generations ago. Some places, Norfolk, Virginia, parts of Florida, are now having 50 or 60 days per year already where they're experiencing this supposedly rare nuisance flooding. That's already, and that's just with that sea level rise that we mentioned so far, no acceleration. So the statistics have shifted, and they've shifted profoundly. Now let's talk about the more extreme case of the 1 in 100-year high water levels, right? New York City, that's about a 10-foot storm surge. That's higher than I can reach. And what we're seeing here is a projection, but it's the super conservative projection. If we only have 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise, right? That was that best case scenario on that plot I showed you previously, just 1 to 2 feet. If we get that best case scenario, and even if storms don't change at all, I'm not invoking stronger hurricanes, stronger nor'easters, or any of that, just by the gradual creep of sea level rise. The high water levels in each of these cities that used to happen once every 100 years becomes, in the lifetime of the typical mortgage event, once every 30 years, everywhere. And there are a lot of places where it becomes an every year or every 2-year event. We have not planned for this. When we think about the impacts on real estate, ability to fund infrastructure, these are huge challenges. So thinking about the task to this group, we're going to need the level of ambition that you're discussing. Because if we keep emitting globally the ways we have been in the past, we're moving towards trajectories that it's not going to be possible to adapt to everywhere. Some areas like New York are going to be better positioned in terms of adaptation, preparing for these climate changes than others. But there are scenarios here that nobody can adapt to. And there are vulnerable people around the world who can't adapt to much more than we're already seeing. Okay, it's not just changes in temperature, changes in sea level and coastal flooding. As I'm sure many of you know or have observed, we're seeing major changes in the heavy rain events. If we key in on the northeast here where you see that 55%, that 55, what that's telling you is if we look at the wettest day per year, and again, we compare the 1950s to 2 generations later, right now, how much rain is falling on that wettest day per year? And the answer is 55% more than was falling when a lot of our infrastructure was built 2 generations ago. Some of that could be natural variability, but not all of it. We understand the physics really well. You warm the atmosphere, it's going to hold more moisture, it tends to fall out in these heavy storms. And we look around the globe and we see these types of trends. So extreme events are already changing dramatically. Our infrastructure is not up to this. We can't afford to have it get much worse. Okay, thinking a little bit about projections, just again showing the sort of global scale here. There are different scenarios of what we could do. First, to focus on the right where it says RCP 8.5. We don't have to worry about the details of that. It's just that's a world where we keep globally emitting the way we have been over the last 5, 10, 20, 30 years. That's a trajectory where you see warming on the level in parts of the U.S. even, something on the order of over 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This is Celsius. It's something we can't rule out by end of the century. That's not a world we're going to be able to adapt to. Instead, we need to try to get somewhere near this trajectory. This is the really extreme alternative, probably more than we could possibly do. This is essentially cutting off emissions altogether. We still would get some additional warming, but it looks manageable. It's in that more sort of 1.5 degree amount roughly. So this is the part of the source of the urgency for why emissions need to be reduced so dramatically, not just in New York, but globally. Okay, a couple more slides that show a little more of that global view. So this is the amount of global warming on this axis, so in Celsius. So here you see that gray line, that's the 1 degree Celsius or so that we've already experienced. And what you also see are these critical systems around the globe. Our coral reefs, key basis of the marine food chain. Crop yields, ability of people to perform outdoor labor, ability of people with pre-existing health conditions to be able to continue to function outside. Anywhere you see these red or purple colors emerging, that's the sign of a system that's basically pushed to the brink already. So for our coral reefs, with that 1 degree Celsius, there are already real questions about whether these systems are going to be able to adapt, even if we don't get much more warming. Hence the urgency. And we can see this looking across other systems. The Arctic, where sea ice has been disappearing extremely quickly, right? Far more quickly than our climate model said. If Arctic sea ice continues to go, we've lost 75% or so of the volume of late summer Arctic sea ice, again, in those last 2 generations. That's a powerful feedback, because when you have that white surface up there reflecting all the sunlight that's perpetual during the summer season, you don't get a lot of heating. But as that ice starts to melt, now we have a dark ocean surface that absorbs that sunlight, causes more warming, melting more ice. There could be a tipping point in that system if we push beyond, say, 1.5 degrees, certainly 2 degrees Celsius, hence the urgency. Okay, so what do we actually see? How does this translate into the types of emissions that we need to see across society? Here you see essentially emissions per year, right? So this is where we are globally in 2010, and then these different trajectories here just out to 2030. So this business as usual scenario would lead to more emissions, probably put us on a pathway towards 4 degrees Celsius of warming or more by the end of the century, which I hope I've made the case by now is not a world we can afford to see. If we do a little bit better job, there's been some improvement arguably in recent years. Some of the current policies in place could drop this a little lower. If you think about the Paris Accord and COP and some of these follow-ups, we've put some things in place that might limit warming to, say, 3.5 degrees Celsius. But that's not going to be enough. We need to get onto one of these 2 trajectories, right, where emissions fall significantly by 2030. This is the pathway consistent with about 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And if we want to limit to 1.5 degrees, it's this level of ambition that's required. This is a huge challenge. Clearly not all the technologies are here today, but through leadership, like you all are discussing, we can bend the curve. And thinking about the role of New York, we heard the 13th biggest economy, to send the right signals that this can be done. If we look at how the prices are coming down for renewables, battery technology, this is starting to look doable, but this is the kind of thing that can have a huge impact. If anybody tries to say New York's emissions aren't important enough to matter, they are important to begin with. It's a significant chunk. But the key issue is the sort of leverage point, reputationally. If New York sends a signal, California sends a signal, the world will listen. It can change the whole narrative. Okay, very quick run through of some things in New York State that I've been fortunate enough to have a chance to participate in Columbia. The Climate Report of 2011, updated in 2014, has led to some real policy initiatives, some of them codified into planning around, as you all know, in terms of flood levels, for example. So what are some of these local hazards that we're all aware of? Heat waves, cold snaps, the heavy downpours I mentioned, changes in snowfall, river flooding, the coastal flooding as well associated with storm surge and sea level rise that we talked about. So just a quick walk through here. Some of the observed trends in New York. What we saw globally and for the U.S. is happening in New York as well. Almost 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit per decade warming trend. If you calculate that out, that gets you to 1.2 degrees or so Fahrenheit of warming since 1950. That's continued since 2013. And across northeast regions, you can see that warming trend. Again, you might be able to cherry pick a grid box or two where you see blue that's had a little bit of cooling. But from the perspective of planning for the future, thinking about our electrical grids that we need, our road surfaces, energy demand, public health needs of people, our ecosystems. Thinking about all the pest species that are making their way further north now. We don't get as many of those extreme cold winter temperatures. It's linked to these warming trends. It's part of the story. As we think about projections, the 2000, let's key in these updated projections we did in 2014. You see the amount of warming that we could see across New York State. There's a range depending on what emissions pathway we're on, and models differ in their sensitivity. But you see that future of Fahrenheit where we could be between 6 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit of warming if we don't dramatically reduce our emissions, which is what you all are moving forward now. This wasn't on the table 5, 6 years ago. Precipitation, it could stay constant essentially over the entire year. This is like the total precipitation for the year. Could go up to by about 20% or so. This is somewhere where there's more uncertainties than there is for temperature, sea level rise, and coastal flooding, but the balance of evidence suggests increase in annual precipitation, just like we're seeing increases in the really heavy rain events. It's not necessarily going to fall evenly, though. We might even see a little bit of a decrease in summer rainfall at the same time when those higher temperatures I mentioned earlier are going to be sucking more moisture out of the soil, more moisture out of the vegetation, meaning that you'd effectively need to be getting a lot more rainfall in summer just to maintain the soil balances of the past. So that's going to introduce presumably some drought risks, especially for places that don't have the large reservoirs. And then you see some of the sea level rise projections that I mentioned earlier. This is what we call sort of the middle of the road projections, maybe the most likely scenario, but not including these lower probability, high consequence outcomes of extreme sea level rise, high or low. Quick walk through these impacts. Certainly as temperatures rise, more stresses on our water systems, energy, transportation, telecommunications infrastructure. More heat stress for people. It's also not just temperature, it's also humidity. A lot of the research now is highlighting that the nighttime temperatures are staying a lot higher, which has big human health impacts. A lot of that is related to just having more moisture in the air. These changes in pest populations. We had a paper a couple years ago that looked at the southern pine beetle making its way north. Just 10, 20 years ago, it was southern end of New Jersey or further south. Can't call it southern anymore. It's making its way further north. It's a complicated story, but a big part of it is that we're not getting as much of those really extreme duration cold air outbreaks where it gets so cold that the beetle can't even sort of hide out in the trees. And that has potential impacts on a lot of critical species, a lot of critical winter activities, fall activities, just to name a few things. And air quality, also very clearly linked in complicated ways, but some of it's fairly simple. Higher temperatures give you more low-level ozone, for example, which can give you kind of a double whammy for people's health, right? They're suffering from the higher temperatures, those with pre-existing health conditions. The air quality is poor, and if the risk of the power going out were to also be higher, that's a potential triple whammy. On the precipitation side, I mentioned these heavy rain events, right? They're fouling our waterways. These are combined sewer overflow events, for example. We're seeing many things running off, heightening the risk of river flooding. Many people in the room have a lot of experience, I know, with all these things. We could talk about Irene. We could talk about the event towards Islip depicted there a few years ago. I know there's many examples of this. And then the sea level rise story. This has all sort of already been covered, but increased risk of storm-related, surge-related flooding, so more frequent and more intense coastal flood events, even if storms don't get any stronger, just because we're raising the sea level. Now, the balance of evidence suggests that big hurricanes probably are going to get a little stronger. This, again, is not something where it's set in stone and we're sure about it. This is a true uncertainty, but talk to the majority of the scientists. If you had to bet on the storm, the big hurricane's getting a little bit stronger, primarily because the upper oceans are going to warm, and as you all know, that's a critical player, not the only player in hurricane strength, is a warm upper ocean. And then it's not all just about the storm surge, right? What's happening to the water table in some of our low-lying areas? Is salt making its way into the aquifers? Are other nasty things, relic pollution, making their way into our waterways? These are all going to be increasing risks with sea level rise. We have to think about all of our infrastructure that's in low-lying areas too, of various types and ecosystems. Okay, my final slide, I hope I haven't taken too much time, but just to sort of hit at a few of the key things. I hope I showed that if somebody tells you we've had 1 degree Celsius of global warming, how could that matter, given that temperature can vary from one day to the next by 12 or 13 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, that 1 degree Celsius, I should say, that's 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. We haven't had quite that much warming yet. I hope I've shown you that that's already had a huge impact on the frequency of heat extremes, cold extremes, heavy rain events, drought even in other parts of the US and globally. As long as greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, even if the rate of increase goes down, we expect to see an increase in these types of extreme events. Think of it as a bathtub, right? So the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is what drives the warming, is how much water is in the tub. The situation we're in right now is that we got a faucet that's just pouring out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and our sink at the bottom of the tub is not very effective, so it's way out of balance. We need to dramatically reduce our emissions. If we just make small drops in emissions, the tub keeps rising, giving you more and more warming. Hence the need for the kind of ambition that you all are going to be talking about today. We need to get that system in balance, and longer term, maybe 50, 100 years from now, there might be real technologies to pull some of that carbon right out of the atmosphere. That technology does not exist today, but efforts like this can help buy us time for new technologies to emerge, in addition to, in their own right, critically turning the curve for us. And it's not just on the climate side that we see these nonlinearities, right? That 1 degree of warming, Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, is already, as we look around the world, starting to cause various ecosystems and even some social and economic systems to scream out, right? There's real concern already about viability of coastal real estate in many places. We convened a conference last summer on this issue of managed retreat. The first time people got together to talk about the idea that there are going to be some places where people are going to have to move away if we don't dramatically reduce our emissions. So that's already with just a little bit of warming. If you look at growing rates of conflict around the world, our systems may be more vulnerable than we thought. We're relatively fortunate here in New York, but we need to also care about other parts of the world. And the further we push the climate system, increasing our greenhouse gas concentrations, the bigger the chance for what I call here disruption, just something that's not linear and well ordered. Kind of things I didn't focus on here. If we push that system more, we can't assume that the climate models that I showed you can handle all of those tail outcomes. If we were to lose all of our Arctic sea ice one summer in the next 5 or 10 years, which is relatively unlikely but not impossible, it's something that absolutely could happen with the right combination, wrong combination of extreme heat, all bets will be off in a sense of what happens that following fall and winter. Nobody's going to be able to tell you for sure how the jet stream is going to behave, how the sequence of weather is going to behave, globally what could happen to simultaneous heat waves and droughts in key breadbasket regions. This sounds alarmist. I'm not saying these are likely scenarios, but what I can tell you for sure is if we keep globally emitting a lot, those types of things become more plausible, those kind of blind spots that you can't really prepare for, that our reinsurance, our insurance, certainly isn't ready to think about, and most of our systems aren't as well. Those are the scary tipping points, but what's so exciting about today is that last point there, which I firmly believe. We can see tipping points on the social side that are just as fast, that surprise relative to what people were saying 5, 10, 15 years ago. Just look what's happening. Look at the price of renewables. Look at movements that we're seeing to force companies to disclose their vulnerabilities to extreme weather and climate. This is the way the future appears to be moving to me. Look at the liabilities that fossil fuel majors are more and more facing as extreme event attribution grows. I don't have time to get into that. There is real potential to move the curve quickly, shift this narrative, and first movers, states, entities, agencies, I think are going to have huge opportunities in that regard. I think we can turn this narrative so that tipping points are working on our favor via that last bullet rather than all the negatives that I focused on through most of the presentation. Thank you.
So Alicia and I thought it was very important to lead off with science. I mean, science has to be our guide throughout this entire process, right? And I think today, with that presentation, it's a reaffirmation of some of the things that we know anecdotally and some of our responses to hurricanes and floods and droughts over the years. But to have you articulate that, I think, was very forceful. I hope you can continue to be a resource for us through this process. Thank you. Are there any questions for Dr. Horton while we have him? Council? I have one question for you.
Yeah.
We relied on some of your science for the sea level rise projections. Do you see us needing to get back to the table to re-revise any of those numbers in the foreseeable, say, 2 years?
Yeah, that's a great question on the sea level rise side. I think it's, maybe it's a question of degree. I think certainly a sort of qualitative check-in, what's been happening with some of the latest papers over the last couple of years makes sense. I also think that certainly in the prior assessments, we tried to really give a full range for sea level rise especially. We tried to say, here's what the models say, but let's think out the box. Let's get out of the box. Let's get some people in the room who are more system thinkers, risk management thinkers. So we tried really in that upper tail to consider as many possible outcomes as we could. Having said that, it might make sense to look again, but I think there's already a pretty broad range shown there. One other thing I just realized I should have highlighted, I didn't speak directly towards the ambition of this group. I'm not an expert on the energy side so much, but when I look at the scale of the ambition here, that looks like consistent with a 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius target. I believe was designed to some extent with those goals in mind. There are some uncertainties, but I just wanted to make that clear that if we saw that level of ambition with the implementation, obviously, with the getting it done, that is, I believe, consistent with bending the curve to those extreme levels, the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, that prevent a lot of those really terrible impacts. That's something I should have highlighted.
Great. Okay, any other questions for Dr. Horton? Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, now we'll transition into the act itself. Alicia?
Sure, thank you. And so Basil and I will tag team this presentation for the next bit here, and that was a perfect segue. So thank you again, Dr. Horton, not only for being here for what is frankly a very sobering presentation, but for really grounding us in exactly what's at stake and the work we have ahead of us. So as we teed up at the beginning, this council obviously is coming together as a result of the enactment of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Cuomo last summer, and which became effective January 1st, 2020. Oh. Okay. Let me see. Is that a bit better? Yeah. I can pull it forward. Thanks for letting us. Well, I can't pull it forward too much.
You can pull it. Go ahead.
Okay. Is that better? Let me see. Okay. Well, I hope many of the council members are familiar with the act, so I'll go through this next part of the presentation relatively quickly, but really exactly to Dr. Horton's last point, it's really important to understand that the act does set us on what is, yes, an extremely ambitious path, and we talk about that ambition a lot. Oftentimes, the comments about ambition come side by side, a lot of questions about how we will get there and how to tackle some of the more complicated issues that we will confront. But the starting point really is here at the top of the slide, 85% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by mid-century, and that is in fact what the international scientific community recommends as the level of ambition, as was stated, in order to bend those curves, those emission curves down, and to try to contain these changes to some of those lower lower degree scenarios rather than the higher degree scenarios, which, as we just went through, are going to be extremely challenging for our state to adapt to. So the major highlights in the bill are shown on the slide, and certainly the commitment to 100% clean electricity in 2040, 70% renewable energy by 2030, our commitments to offshore wind, distributed solar, energy storage. These are all critically important components of the work that the state has ahead, of course, including our commitments to energy efficiency and a number of other efforts that aren't on this slide, and which I'll get into in a little more detail in a moment. This is essentially the roadmap that the Act lays out for the initial set of work that the state needs to undertake in order to hit the premise of that greenhouse gas reduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about this further in the meeting, but it's also important to know that we are not coming at this from a standing start. We are already working hard to walk towards these goals. We have put in place a number of nation-leading efforts in recent years under the governor's leadership. So we do believe we are in a very strong position starting out of the gate in order to be able to hit these targets as we need to do. Also, we'll get into more detail. Commissioner Sagos actually will get into more detail on this topic, but it is critically important and central to this law, the commitments to climate justice and just transition. That will be an important component of the work ahead for the council as well, and something that indeed will be incredibly important for New Yorkers all over our state. So, as I just alluded to, we have not waited to get started in some of the hard work. Much of this activity does, in fact, predate the law, but it is foundational to understanding where do we sit today, where are we already making progress, and then again, where do we need to focus and undertake potentially new thinking and new efforts in order to meet the targets that are required under the law. New York has been aggressively pursuing the development of renewable energy in recent years. That includes large-scale land-based renewables, offshore wind, distributed solar, and more, and we are seeing very strong growth in some of those sectors already, and enormous potential from the advancement of projects we see coming forward both on land and offshore in the case of offshore wind. We have undertaken landmark energy efficiency initiatives in recent years, particularly as directed by our colleagues at the Public Service Commission, who have set the state really on a path to essentially doubling our investments in energy efficiency over the next years towards some of the targets we have for 2025. And energy efficiency as a topic, I'm sure, will be a frequent subject of discussion. It is one of our cornerstone strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have a strong focus already on clean transportation and electric vehicles, and a number of agencies are contributing already to the advancement of clean transportation solutions. We certainly do have a lot of work ahead in reducing emissions in the transportation sector, but again, we are already starting with some clear focus on trying to harness the opportunity we have ahead of us to be a leader in battery storage technology, as well as advancing potentially new manufacturing opportunities associated with clean transportation and the like. The governor has also put really groundbreaking level of financial support behind these initiatives. As he specified in his executive budget address, a 5-year, $33 billion plan to advance climate solutions, including the proposal for the $3 billion Restore Mother Nature Bond Act, to help the state also make investments not only in our energy system, but in other solutions that will be needed in order to help our state respond to and adapt to the changing climate that we know we are already experiencing. And I think very heartening to point out that communities across the state are invested in this process as well. This is not simply a top-down state-led initiative, but through, for example, the Climate Smart Communities program at DEC and the Clean Energy Communities program that my agency runs, we are seeing significant adoption of clean energy strategies and climate commitment activities by local governments across the state. As you can see on the slide, we've got approximately 300 communities in both programs each that are really our partners in this work, and that's going to be incredibly important to our success going forward. Just a couple of slides now to sort of anchor ourselves in where we sit today in terms of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions profile. So for a little baselining, this slide is really focused on our emissions in 2016, which is the current baseline year for calculating emissions, and that's the work that DEC and NYSERDA lead to publish that information. I do want to acknowledge also an important topic that I believe Jared Schneider will cover in a little more detail later, which is that the law does require some changes to how we calculate greenhouse gas emissions methodology, including using the 20-year global warming potential and a full life cycle analysis for fossil fuels that will be changing a little bit the numbers that we have been relying on in recent years. In 2016, New York emitted 206 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, and as was acknowledged in the prior presentation, while we represent a small portion of global emissions, we are still significant given the size of our economy, and of course, it cannot be stated enough, I think, that the signaling effect of following New York's lead, we expect to be extremely important in our work ahead. Transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for 36% of the total. The building sector accounts for 30% of our emissions. Electricity is at 15% of total emissions, followed by waste at 8%, industry at 5%, and agriculture at 4%. This slide presents some of that information more in a time horizon kind of way. And for those of you that maybe farther back and can't see, I'll try to illustrate that the first bar on the far left is our baseline year. That's 1990 sector emissions. The second bar is for our year that was the high water mark for emissions. The third bar is where we are today, again, those 2016 calculated emissions that I already spoke to. And then if you look to the last bar, that is the 2050 emissions requirement in the statute, and of course that interim 2030 emissions target as well. So as you can see, looking at the horizon starting from 1990, we have had some success in decreasing since then due to a number of efforts, but we do indeed have a long way to go, and you see that the rate of change will need to be faster in the years ahead than it has been 4 years in the past. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Basil, to cover the next section.
Great. And I'll go through this quickly. The roles and responsibilities envisioned by the law. The council is not responsible for everything, but you have an enormous task ahead of you. There's no question about it. Culminating with really what is a regulatory approach forward in several months, years. I think one key note is that, and Alicia has alluded to this already, we are not waiting for the work of the council. What we intend to do is structure as much of the ongoing work as possible to meet where we think we will end up or exceed where we will end up. That's the work of NYSERDA, PSC, NYPA, many other entities in the room here. So obviously the Climate Action Council preparing its scoping plan to achieve 40 by 30 and 80 by 50, as well as the carbon neutrality goals. The Climate Justice Working Group, which is to establish criteria to develop a list of the disadvantaged communities the Just Transition Work Group, which we'll talk about a little bit more later in the presentation today. Again, a study on job creation, how we protect New York's jobs. PSC and DEC, obviously, we pivot into a regulatory mindset. PSC's view towards some of the load-serving entities, and DEC towards creating limits, enforceable limits on emissions, establishing a value of carbon, being able to create well-understood annual reports on emissions so we can begin tracking what we do and how we succeed as a state to meet our targets, and of course ending with those regulations. All of our colleagues on the cabinet, you will all have a role. This is not just DEC and PSC and NYSERDA. This is a economy-wide and therefore a government-wide path forward. Some, I would call it housekeeping on our approach forward. I mean, our scoping plan is meant to be aggressive and actionable. That is the scoping plan. The scoping plan has within it measures to achieve those limits, including carbon neutrality. We will be looking at a very detailed cost-benefit analysis, and that is a holistic approach to the costs and benefits of our actions. And of course, being able to measure and then improve our emissions and the pollutants involved in disadvantaged communities who have borne an unfortunate and disproportionate burden over the last number of decades. So with the process, we as a council will rely greatly upon the workhorses of the advisory panels and the Just Transition Work Group in close consultation with the two environmental justice groups, the Climate Justice Working Group and the Environmental Justice Advisory Group. Again, this is a public process. We are to have a minimum of 6 public meetings. And it is designed to be an approach that can evolve over time as we begin to understand even more about the science and how we need to adapt our laws and regulations to meet the needs. Talked about the scoping plan. This is a minimum. The measures must address standards for the greenhouse gas sources. We will look to the electricity sector. Look to industry and other related industries regarding synthetic greenhouse gases, certainly land use planning and agriculture, transportation. We mentioned energy efficiency. That will be a core component of what we do here. Looking for opportunities for carbon sequestration long term. And then, certainly looking at our workforce, which we will depend upon for the next number of generations to survive as a state. Emission leakage being a critical component here, because what we do in New York, we don't want to see negative side effects in other states. So on to the advisory panels. Alicia will touch on this in greater detail shortly. Merely include this slide as a list of what we have. The advisory panels will be chaired by the relevant agency heads. There will be 5 voting members on each, and again, those once these panels are comprised of individuals and paneled with their targets, they will be then consulting with us and with each other on an ongoing basis. So central to the CLCPA was the concept of climate justice. I mean, that is actually embedded in the entire act. DEC will be convening a climate justice working group that is designed to develop criteria and a list of disadvantaged communities, and then report on barriers. Again, this will involve significant public input. And you recognize that climate justice is not just an urban issue, but also very much so a rural issue. The law itself, if climate justice and environmental justice permeates the law, then we need to orient ourselves as we begin conceiving of regulations, how our actions can then benefit those communities and improve the conditions in those communities. The council will do that both in its consultation and its substantive recommendations moving forward. The DEC rulemakings will have that as a centerpiece. Then ensuring, of course, that no unintended consequences come out of our regulations, no related co-pollutant emissions. That certainly would not be an outcome we would support. Co-pollutant would be NOx, SOx, hazardous air pollutants. If you're cutting down on carbon dioxide or methane emissions, you certainly don't want to see any other emissions go up. And on community air monitoring, DEC will be implementing at least 4 community air monitoring pilot stations under a pilot program, so that we can better judge around the state how we are proceeding, and those would be in disadvantaged communities. I mentioned the law itself. Well, the law actually requires 35% of the benefits to be invested in disadvantaged communities, but with a target of 40%. So, in my view, our posture should be towards 40%. Yes, 35% is what the law requires, but we need to lean forward. And those investments would cover such things as workforce development, housing, pollution reduction, low-income energy assistance, transportation, economic development, and so forth. Two significant environmental justice groups. One is the Permanent Environmental Justice Advisory Group. That is a group that will be appointed both by the governor and the legislature. Some of the preliminary work on that is underway. And then to carry forward and really expand upon some of the work that's already underway right now between all the various agencies, DEC, SD, EFC, NYSERDA, PSC, and NYPA, and many others. DEC will convene that, and that's, in my view, designed to help us not just with the CAC and the CALCPA, all of these acronyms, but to help us really agency-wide and government-wide. Jared, you're on deck now. Actually, you're at bat to talk about the very compressed and aggressive timeline.
All right, thank you.
Can you hand me that microphone?
Just pull it out of the... All right. Thanks very much, Basil. So, what you see on this slide is all the work that we have to do over the next 4 years. The work that the council has to do is on top in yellow. You only have to do this work for 3 years. Where we are right now, beginning of 2020, is the first meeting. We need to convene those advisory panels quickly so they can start doing their work. And that will then begin the process of starting to draft the scoping plan, working with those advisory panels as they put together their recommendations over the next 2 years and consult with the climate justice and environmental justice groups. By January 1st, 2022, the council needs to issue a draft scoping plan for public comment. There's a year public comment process, or a year before the council needs to then produce the final plan based on this initial plan, the draft plan, and the public comment that came in. Now, so that puts us January 1st, 2023. The council's work is done for now with that scoping plan. Now, the council, the way the legislation is worded is the council will then reconvene periodically to evaluate progress and determine what changes should be made with technology advancement and the like. At the same time, the agencies will be doing their work. DEC will convene the Climate Justice Working Group. DEC is required to undertake 2 separate proceedings that Basil mentioned and Alicia mentioned as well by the end of this year. One of those is an emission limit rulemaking, which will convert those percentage reductions to tonnage levels that we need to reduce. So 40% by 2030, that DEC rulemaking will then say, what does that mean in terms of tons emitted in New York State by 2030? Now, as Alicia mentioned, that that requires a couple of changes from our current way of inventorying emissions. One is we're supposed to look at upstream fossil fuel emissions. So, when we consume natural gas, petroleum in New York State, what are the upstream emissions associated with those emissions? We have to consider those, and as we meet these targets of 40% reduction and 85% reduction, that includes those upstream emissions. It also requires us to look at a 20-year global warming potential for pollutants other than CO2. That's things like methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and the like. So that's one rulemaking that we're engaged in. The legislation actually specifies that we're required to engage with the public or consult with the public, with stakeholders, and with the council in developing this rulemaking. So we have had a couple of webinars for the public. Those webinars are available online. We can point members of the council to those webinars, so you can, sort of understand a little bit more the process of developing that regulation right now. And if the council is interested, we can put this on the agenda for a subsequent meeting to get additional input from the council. A second proceeding is developing the social cost of carbon. And actually, the way the legislation refers to that is the value of carbon. There's two ways of doing it, and the legislation, sort of gives us the ability to look at both ways of valuing carbon. One is the social cost of carbon based on the damage caused by emitting a ton of carbon emissions. Second is looking at the sort of the cost of mitigation, the marginal cost of abatement is sort of the second way that we can use to value that ton of carbon. And now this is a non-regulatory process. So this is not going to result in a regulation. This is going to result in a guidance document that DEC will prepare that can then be used by agencies and others in making their decisions. So that also has to be done by the end of 2021. By the end of 2020, I'm sorry. By mid-2021, the Public Service Commission will need to finish their proceeding on implementing or developing the program to implement the 70% renewable by 2030 requirement. And then a number of working groups will be doing their work. And then every 2 years, or every year, DEC needs to produce reports of greenhouse gas emissions, again, using that methodology that I talked about for the emission limits. The final thing that DEC has to do is 2024. By January 1st, 2024, DEC needs to develop and adopt the regulations that will ensure that the emission limits are met. That's what the statute says. That's a year after the scoping plan is due. That's going to be, an incredibly busy time for DEC. And one thing, a lesson from that, or direction for the council from that is that there's a need to make the council's recommendations actionable so that we can implement them, effectuate them through rule-making exercises, through rules that will ensure that we meet those limits. That's DEC and other agencies as well. So that's really a summary of the timeline ahead of us. Do you want me to take any questions or just move on to next topic?
Any questions about timelines? I guess eat your Wheaties and sleep when you can, bottom line. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to you all, if that's okay. I think we would like to hear, Alicia and I would like to hear your views of your role here, of the CAC aspirations. Given our numbers in the room, probably keep it brief, 2-3 minutes tops. But you bring a unique background, all of you. What do you see as the path forward, and what are the big challenges? What are the things you want to accomplish, and any other sage advice or wisdom that you have at the outset of this great journey? I'll turn over to John Rhodes to kick things off. John, speak loudly.
Okay, I'm not gonna, can I forgo the mic?
You're good.
So, thank you, you've set this up really appropriately. I think we all have to be excited and committed about working on this urgently important work. The CLCPA is a foundational, landmark bit of law, but it's the actions that count. They need to be strong, they need to be just and equitable, and they need to be practical, and they need to be at scale. Alicia talked a little bit about our portfolio of what we've been doing. There are a lot of sectors that we need to make progress in. Some of them we're getting going on. Buildings and transportation are big ones where we have a good bit of work ahead of us. Electricity will be a big part of the solution. My agency is kind of an electricity agency, so that's obviously going to be something we're going to be paying attention to getting right. But also, we're an energy agency, and even though we've made great strides, I think of all the sectors, that's the one where we've done the best. We have more acceleration to do there as well. Alicia mentioned that we haven't been holding back. We've been making progress and continue to do that. I know that what we're doing is aligned with where this council wants to go, and we'll ensure we stay converged. Thank you.
Great. And since we didn't go around in the beginning, please introduce yourself.
I'm John Rhodes, Public Service Commission. Sorry.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ann Reynolds from the Alliance for Clean Energy of New York. For those of you on the council unfamiliar with ACE, we are a membership organization, and just to let you know what my bias is, our members are renewable energy companies, solar, wind, offshore wind, hydroelectric, sustainable biomass, fuel cells. We have companies that do energy efficiency and companies that do electric vehicles. So that sort of explains my point of view in a way, and we really feel like efforts to deploy all those industries are what's going to make us successful. I'm very happy to hear, and I of course knew already, but happy to hear you emphasize that the state's moving ahead with measures in advance of this council coming up with a plan. But I still would like to offer an opinion that I think it would be valuable for the council to consider having deliverables other than a scoping plan 2 years from now. Although that's our most important assignment, there's specific goals enumerated in the law, and there's also very good ideas that many in the room know about, and I think it would be valuable for this council to endorse them in some way, maybe through a resolution on ideas that can be put forward in advance of 2 years from now, especially given the timeline that Jared just laid out. It's so time-consuming for DEC to issue regulations, and so having them get started on some of those in advance of the final plan, I think would be a recipe for success. So again, so happy to be here and really honored to be able to be included, and look forward to working with you all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Roberta Reardon, and I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Labor for New York State. I am thrilled to be part of this body. This is something that I personally have been invested in for a long time, so to be able to work in this capacity means a lot to me personally. But for the Department of Labor, this is a really important part of our mission. One of our big footprints in the world is workforce development. And obviously, workforce is going to be a critical part of this. Not only training people to do new jobs, but transitioning people to different expectations of their work and the mechanics that they work with, helping people understand that this is not to be feared, but something to be expected and embraced. We oversee the registered apprenticeship programs in New York State, so we have some training capacity already, and we've already been working, of course, with organized labor in these areas. They've been very forward-thinking on this, which is very helpful, but this is a very critical timeline, and the time for thinking is gone, and the time for doing is now. And, you know, to take President Clinton's election slogan and change it, it's the future, stupid. And we need to make sure that everybody that we work with understands that it's not in the future, it's now. And I'm happy to get to work on it.
Great, thank you. Doctor?
I'm Paul Shepson. I'm Dean of the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. I, too, am honored and humbled to be on this council. I think that it will, in fact, be the most important thing that I have ever done, and I haven't done anything yet. So my view is among the greatest challenges we have is how to go about financing the investments that need to be made. That's out of my area of expertise. My area of expertise is in greenhouse gas emissions measurement and quantification. We have quantitative goals here, and since I'm a scientist, I will ask annoying questions that scientists ask. Like, I know that measuring quantifying the current emissions is an inexact science. Doing so for 30 years ago is even more uncertain. And so I'll be interested in having conversations and contributing to understanding where we are, where we have been, and where we need to go. Anyway, lots of great challenges, and I will work hard to help get us there.
Thank you. And we have sitting in for us, Dr. Zucker got called off, I hope, for a good reason. Henry Spletoff from DOH.
Right. That's right, and that's exactly how to pronounce it. It's great. Thank you. I'm Henry Spletoff with the Department of Health. I work in. I'm the head of.
Just speak up, maybe this. Yeah, hold up.
I'm head of the Prevention and Sustainability section in the Center for Environmental Health, and I was called in a few minutes before this meeting, so I don't have any prepared remarks. But clearly, climate change is of critical importance and has many implications for public health, and the health department is actively engaged in research and outreach efforts and various activities that are trying to address the future health implications of climate change. And we're very much in support of transitioning to renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the department will do what it can to support this effort, this important effort. And I'm also grateful to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Rose.
I'm Rose Harvey, and I'm a senior fellow at the Regional Plan Association, which is a think tank in the tri-state region of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut on energy, environment, housing, and transportation. And I also have a history here. I was former commissioner of Parks and Historic Preservation. It's an honor to be here. It's a great opportunity. Often states, the federal government will have great vision and landmark legislation, but rarely do we have the opportunity and the focus and the support to really make something happen and do it now. And I come here to really figure out what can work, as John said. Strong initiatives, actionable initiatives, realistic initiatives to meet the goals. And given my background in land use and land planning, and also working with urban communities, particularly communities that have been affected by poor land use, I also salute the emphasis on making it fair and equitable for everyone.
Great. Thank you. Commissioner?
I'm Richard Ball, Commissioner at Ag and Markets. Great to be here. This is a very exciting project. We're very much looking forward to our role in it. I would agree with both our co-chairs that we have a little bit of a head start here. We've been talking about our energy goals. We've been talking about developing plans, conservation practices for some time now. I think our relationships with the whole cabinet are excellent, but particularly with you folks here. I think we've been looking at water quality. We've been looking at nutrient management, reducing greenhouse gas emissions for a little while now. They're central, really, to what ag needs to do, wants to do, and the environment objectives that we have in the state. So I feel pretty good about that. I had the opportunity recently to meet with my counterparts in the other 50 states and 4 territories. And I was heartened to see that we're at the forefront. We're being, frankly, looked to by a lot of other states, most other states. So that's encouraging, but we still have a lot of work to do. Clearly, we've got to elevate our capacity to get these things done, to advance those concerns that we have. So I think this makes great sense. It's very timely sense. Ag clearly has a role. We're looking forward to being part of the solution. So thank you.
Thank you. Peter?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Iwanowitz, and I'm the director of a group called Environmental Advocates of New York. But I just want to be clear that I'm here as an individual, not representing that organization. Gives them plausible deniability of the stuff I do here, I guess. I guess sort of the hopes and goals that I have is to sort of appreciate how the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act came to be and the big, robust efforts that changed the sort of dynamic in New York State from a piece of legislation that was about improving New York's environment and dealing with the impacts, not just the threats, but the impacts of a changing climate, and to do it in a more equitable, diverse, and just and inclusive pathway. I just want us all to sort of appreciate the lineage of this law, the effort that went in behind that law for the last 5 years to bring it across the finish line. And as we sort of deliberate how we move New York State's entire economy from one that is built on fossil fuels to one that is entirely supported by clean sources of energy and 100% renewables, that we understand that we do that, there's going to be a lot of social justice issues that we have to grapple with as well. The economic sort of situations and the just transition is going to be highly important, particularly for those that have been left behind in an economy that has been based heretofore on fossil fuels. So as we look at diversity and justice and we look at the environmental imperatives before us, I'd love for the council to consider a more flexible meeting schedule, one that rotates throughout New York State so that all sectors of New York State and the public can have a chance to visit with us and be a part of the meetings, not just here in New York City, but let's rotate the meetings across New York State. Let's flex our schedules to have meetings during the day and the evening, because I firmly believe that if we have a real true focus on equity and diversity and justice as we develop this scoping plan, that we should involve the public much more greatly and endeavor to do that. And I'll also just give one more sort of mention out to a piece of paper and a document that's before us all that was passed out to all of our places before the meeting. I personally view this as sort of our syllabus. The group that brought us the Climate Community Protection Act has laid out before us all in this open letter really their vision of how we should operate, their vision about where we should go. And I hope that we can do it faster than what the statute allows. I second Ann Reynolds' suggestion of trying to fast forward policies. I would love for us to get a scoping plan out earlier than just 2 years, and would love to workshop this more with the public sooner rather than later. Because I firmly believe we're going to need much more of the public with us as we lean into this climate crisis than running away from us. And if we deliberate behind closed doors or do things in a fashion that doesn't involve them from the get-go, we won't have their investment and involvement when it comes to the tough decisions that we're going to have to make in terms of lowering our emissions.
Thank you, Peter. Gil?
Thank you very much, Chairman Sagos, Madam Chair Barton, to my co-members of this council. My name is Gil Quinones. I'm the President and CEO of the New York Power Authority. The New York Power Authority is the largest state-owned electric utility in the United States. We produce about 25% of all electricity in our state, 75% of that from clean hydroelectric power. We also own a third of our power transmission system. So you can think of us, our power transmission system and our large hydroelectric power plants as the backbone of the power system of our state. The electrons that power more than 800 miles of subway tracks in New York City, those electrons are from NYPA, distributed by the local utility Con Edison. The electrons that support over 400,000 jobs across our state through our low-cost economic development power, those electrons are from NYPA. And the power that serves 51 small municipal and rural cooperative systems across our state, those electrons come from NYPA. As always, NYPA will always be a first mover, and it will always lead by example by putting our customers' journey, decarbonization journey, at the center of our strategy. We will also use our own assets and the assets of our customers, and we will invest in the communities where we operate to help accelerate and scale clean energy technologies that we need in this journey. I look forward to working with all of you. I look forward to learning from all of you and others who will be involved in this process. And as we develop our scoping plan, as we consider policy actions, as we consider regulatory proceedings and additional legislative proposals, let's make a pledge that if it's not for all, then it's not for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil.
Good afternoon, everyone. Donna DeCarolis. I am president of National Fuel Gas Distribution Corporation, which is a utility in New York, Western New York, and Northwestern Pennsylvania. In New York State, we have operation in about 11 counties. We have about 530,000 customers, but that's over 1 million people, and 500,000 of those are residential consumers. About 30,000 or so are business and industrial. As a subset of that, we have almost 700 industrial customers in our region. So from my perspective, first of all, I am thrilled to be here. I'm really looking forward to working with you all and getting to know you all better. My concerns and what I think is a challenge really is, and I'm glad I heard it talked about earlier, how do we assess the cost of all this, and how do we assess the customer impact? And so in our region, it's cold. It's about 40% colder than downstate. About 94% of our consumers are heating with natural gas. And I mean, compared to 10 years ago, they're saving about $850 a year, which if you multiply that out, it's like $400 million in our region. So as we think about this, you know, we hope that cost benefit is included, which I'm so happy to hear it will be. But what's that real cost to consumers as they have to think about possible electrification has been brought up. What we hope is that there are pathways being considered that allow for all technologies. So we have zero net energy homes in our region where we're getting major emissions reductions using smaller amounts of natural gas combined with other technologies. There's also natural gas technology evolving, and there's also renewable natural gas and hydrogen blending on the supply side. So we're hoping all these things get included and that the cost benefits really considered, especially for, as well, the industrial sector, which I think a lot of our customers are very interested in engaging. So we're very excited to be here. Happy to participate and to hopefully help with solutions and pathways for customers.
Great. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doctor?
I'm Bob Howarth. I'm a faculty member at Cornell University. I'm very, very pleased to be part of this group and be here today. I'm an Earth system scientist. I've worked on the consequences of climate change for my entire career, 40 years, particularly looking at the effects of agriculture and water quality. And for much of that time, I've looked at methane as a driver of greenhouse gas emissions. I've published widely on the role of methane as a greenhouse gas, particularly coming from the oil and gas sector. I'm actually the most published author in the world on that subject. I helped write the part of the CLCPA language when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting, and I'm very excited to see that. I'm hoping this council will take an active interest in that, because I believe that when the state starts implementing the rules that the CLCPA requires, it'll qualitatively change how we rank what we need to do to reach the targets. So specifically, I appreciate the presentation Alicia gave, and she alluded to the fact that when we account for methane, it may change it somewhat. It will. The number one sector is going to be the building sector all of a sudden, with natural gas a major part of that. So that has to be a major part of our focus. I want to reiterate the comment that Ann and Peter both made, that I hope this council will have intermediate goals and not just have the final document. And I also want to just express a little concern that we not miss the opportunity to pay attention to the integration for all of this, how this will work. As we electrify transportation, as we electrify buildings, as we need to do, we're going to at least double, perhaps increase our electric needs by 2.5-fold. And we need to have that as part of the overall planning and have a real integrated picture of this. So I'm a little concerned that the panels as laid out may not do that. Maybe we as the council can do that, or maybe we need another panel. But again, I'm very excited to be part of this.
Okay, thank you. Anna?
Hi, I'm Anna Chaco. I'm the General Counsel of the Long Island Power Authority, and we are a public power authority serving Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk counties. At the Long Island Power Authority, we're very focused on meeting and exceeding the state's...
Anna, could you speak up just a little bit so the folks in the back can hear? Thanks.
Sorry. Is that better? Yeah. So at LIPA, we're very focused on meeting and exceeding the state's goals as articulated today in the CLCPA. And we're also looking at the impact to our customers, both in creation of jobs and in terms of costs, as Donna mentioned. The hard work of this council will be coming up with a balanced plan that achieves carbon reduction in many areas, including electricity, transportation, and heating in buildings, transitioning from fossil fuels to clean fuel. LIPA, as part of this council, looks forward to working to achieve this plan while continuing to invest in clean energy and clean jobs.
Thank you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Dennis Elsenbeck. I'm a non-lawyer working for a law firm, Phillips Lytle in Buffalo. Also recently named president of a startup battery storage company, Volta Energy, also in Buffalo, New York. One of the concepts that I think we've got to hold over our heads throughout the process is that economic and environmental sustainability are not polar opposites. We actually have to learn to balance them. It's almost like we like separating business from environmentalists, and I just think that's not going to work. Because what you win today, you'll lose tomorrow. So let's make sure that we bring all of that together. I spent 30 years also with the electric utility, Niagara National Grid. I lived through the wonderful laws, PUCA, PURPA, and the 6-cent law here, and saw the excitement of the intent of those laws turn into aggressive fighting to repeal those acts in the 90s. It wasn't fought because of the intent. It was fought because of the implementation strategy. That's why the implementation, for me, is critical. And I know we always have a scientist talking about what's happening in Climate Act, and I love scientists, but I also love economists and engineers, especially engineers. You know, I just want to make sure that's clear. I think we have to project what the costs are going to be as we develop these plans. We have the luxury of having really extensive project queues, both from the ISO's point of view as well as the utility perspectives. We know what the incentive blocks are. We know what the regional energy credits are. So let's not surprise our manufacturing community or our commercial community, because that's what will rise higher in what we're trying to do here. And all of a sudden, we're fighting when we should be working together. They are not cost centers. They actually should be viewed as investors in what we're all trying to do here. Finally, I want to bring alignment. I really appreciate that you sat me next to Mr. Gertler, because I'd like to see more alignment with economic development initiatives, both from a site point of view as well as a market cluster point of view, between energy and economic development. Right now, to be honest with you, and I work in the region, they're treated separately. So I have regional economic development councils that set priority sites, and yet we're not focusing any of our energy towards those sites. So under the REV principles, the Reforming Energy Vision, of looking at co-locating supply and demand, we should actually revisit that, because there are some economic realities of being able to grow our communities based on that. Did anybody see the 60 Minutes on Bahamas? Lack of infrastructure, lack of capacity, lack of resiliency. Well, our inner cities will be able to say the very same thing, by the way. So they cannot revitalize themselves, we cannot grow them economically, because they do not have the very same things that we're worried about in the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. So let's treat our own communities like we would treat the world. Thank you for, and by the way, I love that all the state agencies are here.
Thank you. Eric?
Well, Dennis, thank you for being so welcoming. I appreciate it. Eric Gertler, I'm President and CEO of Empire State Development, which is the state agency focused on economic development. We are focused on job growth, business attraction, infrastructure, among other things. It's an honor to participate on this panel, and I want to thank Commissioner Sagos and President Barton for your important work here in leading this commission. I think as from an ESD perspective and a business perspective, I see our role as twofold in terms of helping the business community connect to this mission and be able to adapt and transform in a green economy. Two areas I see ESD and myself helping on is one, helping to advise companies as they seek to reduce greenhouse gases, certainly those in the industrial sector, and help those companies focus on new green energy solutions. And then two, as I think some of my fellow commissioners have pointed out, like Commissioner Reardon, we are seeing a changing greener economy where there's opportunities for industries to change, for new jobs to grow. New York State has already been a leader in many aspects of this, but I think we need to continue to make sure that industry and jobs are connected as we look to solve what is a real and existential threat around the world in New York State. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Gavin?
Thank you. My name's Gavin Donahue. I am president of the Independent Power Producers of New York. We're referred to as IPNY. I represent my organization over 3/4 of the power generation in New York State. We have all fuel sources. We also have renewable sources, wind, solar, and some storage members as well. We have about 80 members. I worked at DEC in the 90s. I was part of some of the acid rain deposition regulations, the NOx and SOx trading programs when I worked in government here. Very proud of those accomplishments. When I started at IPNY, we were about competitive markets, we're about private investment. We cited over 11,000 megawatts of new energy here in New York State, and at the same time closed almost 8,000 megawatts of dirty, inefficient energy in New York State. And I'm proud to say today we have no more coal plants in New York State. And in upstate New York, we are almost 90% carbon free. Those are statistics I don't think should be lost on anyone. I think through the markets that we've had in New York and the policies, we've been able to promote innovation and technological advances like carbon capture and sequestration, which we need to work on, hydrogen, batteries. All those things cannot be ruled out as we move forward. We support the goals. I'm happy to be here. Basil, you said something about science matters, details matter. One of the things that I'm going to push for in this council is that we have, as part of the working group on power generation, a technical economic feasibility. Because today, We've been around the room, we've talked a lot about science and engineering and modeling, but not one person has talked about reliability. And if we don't have a reliable electricity grid, we're not going to have a healthy state in any way. So we need to talk about reliability. So we need to have a technical economic feasibility study, and we need to have experts like John's staff at the PSC, the ISO, the New York State Reliability Council, because as Commissioner Sago said, that science and details matter as we move forward. So those are the types of priorities that I'm looking for. I know we all have different expertise and experience here. I want to be open-minded. I want to work together, but I think consumer impacts are important and reliability is vitally important to the success of our state.
Thanks, Gavin. Brendan?
Good afternoon. My name is Brendan Hughes. I am the Executive Deputy Secretary of State. Unfortunately, the Secretary of State, Secretary Rosado, sends her regrets she was unable to make it, but I'm happy that I was able to come and sit in for her, as this has been a topic that I've spent much of my professional career on dealing with, so I'm happy to be here. I also want to thank the council for sitting, for putting me next to, can you hear me? Good?
Can you hear?
Better? No?
Some of these mics are less favorable than others. Where's that remote mic?
If I get this close, is that better?
Take us.
We kind of ruined my joke, but I want to thank the council for sitting me next to Dr. Malatras, who has one of the best heads of hair in state government. If only he had, this beard, and he would have made fun of me for something if he was still here. So, the Department of State has a long history of helping communities be more resilient to climate change and implementing programs that reduce carbon impacts. For example, the local waterfront community revitalization program, the downtown revitalization initiative, smart growth programs, the Brownfield Opportunity Program, partnering alongside very closely with environmental justice communities and supporting local governments. And this is all led by our amazing Deputy Secretary of State, Keisha Santiago Martinez, seated behind me right now. So I want to thank her for all her efforts, for this program and many of the others that I just spoke of. And certainly we look to expand on those programs as we move forward, with this council and beyond. With that, the department accepts the governor's challenge to identify real actionable solutions. On behalf of the Secretary of State, we look forward to partnering with all of you on this effort. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. And Jim got called out. He'll be back in a moment. Commissioner?
Good afternoon. All right, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon. First and foremost, my name is Marie-Therese Dominguez. I serve as Commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation. I want to thank our fabulous co-chairs, Commissioner Sagos, President Barton. Your leadership is not only critical and crucial, but is most appreciated, and we thank you. DOT has a sustained and demonstrated commitment to being stewards of our natural environment. It is an ethos that we take very seriously, and we have an opportunity to always work with our state partners, our local partners, in carrying out the highest project standards for resiliency and sea level rise, and recognizing that this council actually has opportunity to further enhance our ability to look at those standards and how we actually execute them. That's something that we will continue to strive to do as part of this committee, this council rather, but also as part of the department's ethos moving forward. We strive to implement our programs and projects in the least invasive and environmentally conscious manner that we possibly can. And recognizing that transportation is indeed one of the largest sectors of greenhouse gas emissions. People are indeed committed to their cars in many ways, but we're making progress every day to provide alternatives to that. One of the things that the department actually takes great pride in is the alternative strategies that we put forward in all of our project plans and development opportunities, certainly as it relates to alternative modes of transportation, whether that be bike, ped, transit, etc. One of the things that I'm terribly pleased about is that New York as a state actually uses the least energy per capita for transportation purposes than any other state in the nation. And that's possible because we've got unparalleled investments that we've been able to make. And certainly this governor has demonstrated that on a daily basis with the investment in public transportation services statewide. The department has also been a national leader in incentivizing and in integrating the use of clean fuel buses as well as all-electric trucks into our public sector as well as our private fleets. And that's critically important moving forward. New York State DOT also invests significantly in non-motorized transportation, as I mentioned before. I had the pleasure last Friday, as a matter of fact, of kicking off yet another project that we're doing in downtown Utica, which is not only an economic revitalization plan, but also something that helps people take yet another step towards non-emissions related travel. So designing projects to actually mitigate bottlenecks, reduce congestion, reduce idling, those are all part of the things that we look forward to. So I want to tee off one thing really quickly that the Commissioner Ball mentioned, and that is the national leadership standards that are occurring across the board. I had the opportunity last week to be in Washington, D.C., along with my counterparts who are the CEOs of the state transportation agencies. And I will tell you that one of the critical elements that all of the states are talking about is the national advocacy around surface transportation, the need for a surface transportation reauthorization bill for all of infrastructure. What's interesting and unique is that the United States Senate actually has a clause in, for the first time, an entire section of the reauthorization bill that they've passed through committee and through the Senate on climate. And New York has led the way on that in terms of advocacy and huge proponents of that. But it is the urgency of now to tee off of what we're about. And we have to take advantage of all of that, both on the national level, but we certainly have the opportunity to lead most aggressively through our actions here in this council here in New York. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Great. Beth?
Thank you. Do I have a mic? Folks can hear me? All right.
I'm going to pull it just a little bit closer. Some of these are not as sensitive.
All right. Oh, dear. Sorry about that. Is that better? Yes. You're good. All right. Well, thank you so much to the co-chairs, for everyone here, and for the introduction. My name is Raya Salter. I'm an energy and utility lawyer, clean energy advocate, and educator who's focused a lot of my work on issues related to energy justice. I'm also a policy organizer with the New York Renews Coalition. I'll just say a few sentences. I'd like to take a moment to thank Leader Stuart Cousins, Speaker Hastie, and of course Governor Cuomo for passing New York's historic climate law. I'd also like to thank all of the advocates whose tireless work is the reason that New York's climate law leads the nation on climate and environmental justice. My hope is that New York's scoping plan becomes a state-of-the-art blueprint and beacon for what a just, clean energy transition will look like. I think this will require both deep local knowledge and the use of best-in-show approaches from other states and throughout the world. I look forward to doing this work. I also strive to help make this scoping plan process as inclusive, open, and accessible as possible so that it can indeed be the people's plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will be brief, since I am last. My name is Ruth Ann Wisnauskas. I'm the Commissioner for New York State Homes and Community Renewal, which is the state agency that focuses on single and multifamily housing finance as well as policy. The work of the, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm both honored and really delighted to be part of this conversation. The work of the council reflects a lot of the work that we do at HCR around the built environment, around our footprint in the built environment. We have always been a leader at the state in pushing the envelope to make sure that affordable housing both has strict green standards and continues to push those standards up as time has gone on. So I think that we have always been at the forefront of that as it relates to affordable housing, and I'm delighted to be able to bring that sort of housing and community development lens to the work here. So I will be brief and say thanks again. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Commissioner. Excellent. I appreciate all your time on this. we're going to transition to what I think is the most exciting component of today's presentation, the bylaws. Come on, people. Get excited. Listen, we've had a chance to circulate the bylaws for review. Hopefully everyone in the room here has had a chance to look at it. Let's have a spirited discussion about it. Right, Peter? And then hopefully take a vote and approve them. So Peter Costello. Costello or Costello?
The Irish pronunciation is Costello.
Costello.
But the American is Costello.
Who is the General Counsel of NYSERDA.
You get big credit for knowing that, by the way.
Hey, I'm just helping you out. Yeah. Peter?
Thanks. I am the General Counsel of NYSERDA, and together with Tom Berkman, the General Counsel of DEC, we'll be acting as co-counsel for the council. Tom unfortunately cannot be here today, but the very capable John Binder is here in his stead. I don't know if I can justify the introduction on how exciting this will be, but I'll try to be brief. I did provide these bylaws to the council several days ago, so hopefully you all have had a chance to review them beforehand. I will go through some highlights. First, for context, this draft was created by a working group consisting of DEC and NYSERDA staff, and the idea behind it is to extract the governing pieces out of legislation and put it into a much more digestible, easy-to-read context, hopefully easy to read. Just a couple highlights. So it goes forth and names the 22 voting members of the council, discusses that the agency members may in fact designate members of staff to act in their stead, that vacancies will be filled by virtue of the original appointment. It discusses that Commissioner Sagos and President Barton will be co-chair, and that they will preside over these meetings and administer the affairs of the council. It names the General Counsels of DEC and NYSERDA, as I said, as co-counsel. It allows the co-chairs to appoint a secretary, and also, should the need arise and it be desirable, to appoint an executive director and staff to help support the work of the council. The bylaws also go through the governance of the meetings themselves in conformance with the statute. For a quorum, the statute defines that as a majority of the council. In this case, this would be 12. So a quorum equals 12. Anytime 12 or more are together, it should be considered an official meeting of the council, in which case I should say that the council meetings are subject to the open meetings law. So let's make sure that we keep those in mind. If there's any questions about that, always reach out to myself or Tom. The normal business of the council is undertaken by a majority affirmative vote. So in this case, again, that would be 12. For the approval of the final scoping plan, as well as those subsequent plans, as Jared mentioned, those require a supermajority. We define that as more than 2/3. 2/3 is, say, 14.6, so it is defined here as 15 members of the council. The bylaws then go through the constituencies of and how to convene advisory panels and the Just Transition Working Group. For those working groups and panels, there are no more than 5 voting members. In terms of the way that voting works there are no quorum requirements. And so the way that the bylaws are drafted is that the panels and the working group should strive for consensus, but if a consensus cannot be achieved, they can deliver their recommendations to the council with minority opinions attached as well. And then in terms of very important public integrity sections of this bylaw, I want to point out sections on confidentiality and conflicts. On confidentiality, confidential information is defined as information that could cause competitive harm to a commercial enterprise. This is generally conforms to the Freedom of Information Law, and the idea is if it is beneficial to the council to obtain commercially sensitive information to do your work, that the folks who are giving us that information have comfort that it will be kept confidential. And then in terms of conflicts of interest are defined as direct conflicts. So those are circumstances in which the council or one of the agencies from the council procures services from consultants or others to support the work of the council. If you are affiliated with any of the folks that may want to respond to any such procurements or solicitations, please come to myself or Tom to discuss both the appearance and the potential for a conflict, and we will work through a process in order to address that. The normal mitigation is to put together a recusal framework. Lastly, in terms of public integrity and ethics, there is a section of the bylaws that specifically asks you not to accept any gifts or anything of value that would infer that you're being influenced in the way that you conduct the business of the council. If there are any questions on that, again, come talk to one of the councils. That free dinner that you're offered, the benefit of that free dinner is not worth the cost to the council. And then lastly, amendments to these bylaws will be considered as normal course business, and so for an amendment, it would require a majority affirmative vote. And with that, I conclude. I'm certainly welcome to take any questions.
Any questions? It was exciting, thank you. Any questions from the council members? Peter?
Yeah, so Peter, I have a question about the meetings provision. Just so that we're clear for everybody in the public. On item C, the co-chair shall furnish public notice requirements of Article 7 of public offices. Or is that 72 hours in advance, or are we going to be making the notice available when we book the meetings pursuant to B there?
So it's at least 72 hours, and we'll try to make every effort to announce the meeting well in advance of that, certainly if it is set. Thank you for this question, because I should take the opportunity to let everyone know that the website is up and running, and so that is the best place to look for those types of notices and the materials. And once these bylaws are approved, we will post them there as well. But thank you for that question.
Do we have the actual URL we can publish right now? It's on the end? Okay, it's at the end. Last slide has a website notice. Yep. Okay.
So we'll post as much public information there as available.
Great. Climate.ny.gov?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Any other questions on the bylaws? You, well, you should leave the glass for the next meeting. At the end, you can have it. 2 years. It's your parting gift. Okay. With that, I'd like to bring the bylaws to the floor for a vote. Is there a motion to approve the bylaws?
Second.
Second?
Can we just have a little discussion? Is that possible before we?
Of course. Sure.
So,
Peter?
Yeah, I personally would love to sort of just have a discussion about the meetings themselves under bylaws 5, Roman numeral 5B, whenever possible. Can we strike that language and just commit to a 10 days advance notice and then make that also the trigger for the public notice? I think giving the public 10 days advance notice of when we're holding meetings and posting that publicly is the way to go. Not only do we have busy schedules, but the public has busy schedules. If they want to be part of this process, we should endeavor to be as inclusive as possible with that notice in advance. So I would hope that we could maybe strike the language whenever possible and just say that the co-chairs will provide. And then link the next paragraph, C, not to the 72 hours advance that's sort of the standard under the public officers law, but just make the same 10 days when we book the meetings, we make them available to the public so people can arrange schedules.
Thoughts on that? Any reactions?
So I'll jump in to say I think we very much appreciate the perspective that you're putting forward in terms of ensuring that the public does have adequate notice and robust ability to participate in the meetings. I think I hope, but I also expect every member of the council strongly agrees with that perspective. I think the language, which was intended to conform, as you pointed out, to the requirements of the law, does, provide a little bit of flexibility should we need to move more expeditiously if the need arises to convene a meeting short of 10 days. So that would, I think, be, the rationale for maintaining the language that says whenever possible. It's clearly evidencing the spirit and intent. And I think we could all, certainly take the feedback and make that the standard operating procedure, but it may be that when it comes to something as rigorous as the bylaws, that we wouldn't want to necessarily curtail our ability to call a more timely meeting should the need arise for one reason or another.
So if we were to make our operating procedures effectively short of the bylaws, that we would announce the next meeting ideally during this meeting, right, float that out there, the next monthly meeting or whatever we want to call it. Would that assuage your concerns? I fully agree with you. We want to get this out to the public as early as possible,
Agreed.
get good turnout, be able to market it, ensure that we have, everyone here in this room has a crazy schedule. There's no doubt. There's no way 72 hours is enough for anyone's schedule in this room. So, but to Alicia's point about the need to move more quickly if we have that desire, does that assuage your concerns?
Yeah, I guess, the more lead time, the better. And I think when we book meetings, we should disclose those publicly at the same time.
Got it. Okay. I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Good. Any other questions, concerns? Yes, sir.
Do you mind if we just have a brief conversation about conflicts of interest before we vote on the bylaws?
Please.
I would just like to hear that everyone agrees that the wording is appropriate and in the best interest of producing the best plan. So as I understand it, if we contracted with a company in which I had a financial interest for services in the process of doing our work, that would represent a conflict of interest, and I would recuse myself. If I were to advocate for content in the scoping plan that, when implemented, would financially benefit a company in which I have an interest, as written, that would not represent a conflict of interest. So I spent 4 years of my life working in the federal government where, believe it or not, conflict of interest rules are of paramount importance. So it's sort of an issue that courses through my bloodstream. Anyway, for the scenario that I suggested, do we all agree that that's appropriate, not a concern for this council? Respectfully, I offer the question.
And it is accepted in the spirit you've offered it. Thank you. So I think, clearly, the issue you're highlighting, which is that the work that this council will do, the recommendations we will make on behalf of the state will have impacts on the way business is conducted in the state going forward and following the implementation of policies that do flow from the recommendations in the scoping plan and/or that may ultimately be adopted via DEC rulemaking to enforce requirements of the law, et cetera. The issue that gets teed up here is that in the representation of this council, the interests, which are varied and which I think were really well represented when we went around, the range of perspectives and expertise and experience that is represented on the council is to the benefit of our work. And individuals have been named to this council in some cases by virtue of our day job, for those of us that serve as commissioners, and then others for specifically their expertise in these issues and representing companies or interests that will in fact be impacted by the work of the council. That's entirely the point of naming individuals with expertise in those areas. So we did think about this, and I'll let any of the staff jump in if need be to add or amend or clarify these comments. But I think my understanding is that in the deliberations and drafting the bylaws, we did consider where exactly to draw that line, given that, of course, again, we want council members to be able to participate fully and represent the areas, industries, and sectors of the economy for which they've been appointed to represent those points of view and provide that expertise, which is why, again, the bylaws suggest these requirements as to direct conflicts of interest. As you said, if an individual has a financial interest in a firm that the council would contract with directly, that would clearly be a conflict. But that more forward-looking scenario that you put forward, I think, would likely go too far in hampering our ability to allow the council members to actually bring forward their expertise and background and informing precisely those decisions that we know will have impact on the state's economy in the future. Is that?
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you, Doctor. Any other questions about conflict of interest or any other components of the bylaws? Okay. So can we move forward with a vote on the bylaws?
Yes, I believe it's been motioned and seconded.
Seconded? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The ayes have it, and the bylaws are approved. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
We are for real now.
They feel different.
I do, legit.
Okay, now this is actually the exciting, one of the exciting components of this conversation. The advisory panels, which will take up, obviously, will be the workhorses under us as we move forward. Alicia?
Thank you. And obviously, Commissioner Sagos did speak a bit about the advisory panels earlier, and not to repeat those comments, but we did want to reorient the conversation back to the advisory panels, given the importance that those panels will play in our work as a council going forward. As diverse and deep as the experience is for the individuals sitting here today and participating in the council, we will also be structured to under the law and as provided now in the bylaws, which also speak to the advisory panels. We will be tapping into additional expertise for, in particular, the 6 subject matter areas that are listed on the slide: transportation, land use and local government, housing and energy efficiency, energy-intensive industries, power generation, agriculture, and forestry. The panels by statute are chaired by the relevant agency heads. The statute also specifies that those panels are comprised of up to 5 voting members that will be elected by the council. So this will be an important function of the council. And to speak a little more broadly about this, the panels really are intended to be the technical experts, the bodies that will roll up their sleeves over the next 18 months or so to advise the council ahead of the adoption of the scoping plan. Certainly, there will be interaction between the councils and the advisory panels ahead of that as well, but these really will be panels that will have quite a lot of work ahead, and that will be looked to in order to provide a lot of the detailed work that will then be assembled and condensed into the broader council process. Going to the next slide. So in thinking about the recommended structure of the advisory panels, we know it will be a difficult task, particularly where the statute lays out a mere 5 voting members for those panels, and many talented people, certainly across the state, who have a lot to contribute to this work. We are recommending that each advisory panel be kept to a reasonable size, ideally under 12 is our recommendation to the council, so that those groups can, again, work in a detailed and collaborative fashion. They will be able to be advised by additional participation of stakeholders and experts and others. That's not to limit the discussion or participation, but in terms of the formal membership. The advisory panels will be supported by state agency staff to facilitate the work of the advisory panels, as well as stakeholder engagement, and agency staff will also be able to support providing analytical and technical support that may be needed for the panels to do their work. We have received many recommendations for individuals to serve on these advisory panels from a wide range of different interests and stakeholders and individuals across the state who are watching this process. And we, will have challenging decisions to make to get to, again, what will ultimately be a comparatively smaller number of individuals that will be selected. We appreciate all of that input, though, and I think we have brought forward significant good ideas about ensuring that all voices who should be at the table will be at the table, that we can really embrace the opportunity to access deep expertise, that we will also be able to have a diversity of perspectives represented in those panels as well, and also reflect the diversity of our state as a whole in the composition of those panels as well. Those are the goals that we have and the process that we envision. I'll come back to the next steps for how we will affect that. I did want to also take the opportunity to highlight and remind again that there is a Just Transition Working Group as well that will provide input to the council as the council prepares the scoping plan. That group, under the statute, is chaired by myself and Commissioner Reardon. It will have 13 to 17 members from labor organizations and EJ communities, clean energy developers. Again, these requirements are laid out in the law. And it will take on a critically important issue for our work ahead as a state, which is to think about how this transition will impact populations and communities, and what are the tangible tactics, resources, and policies we will need to think about as a state in order to make sure that those transitions can be successful. Commissioner, did you want to add anything to that?
No, it's fine.
So then, I guess, wrapping up the discussion on the councils, which is an important topic, and given the critical role that the advisory panels and the Just Transition Working Group will play in assembling our scoping plan, we again will endeavor to identify a group of individuals that bring the right combination of expertise, diversity of perspectives, and hopefully a collaborative and problem-solving mindset to ensure that these panels can be successful and properly advise the council. We have sought input from council members. We will continue to seek further input from you so that we can be positioned to appoint the panels at the next council meeting. That is the objective that we are putting forward, is to do the work between now and then, to work with you to put forward a set of advisory panel members that could be voted at the next meeting. In the meantime, without discussing specific individuals, we'd prefer, particularly just given the short time left for this meeting, we'd prefer to table that discussion for the next meeting when we put forward recommendations. Do any of the council members, however, have feedback or questions on the general composition of the advisory panels that I've just walked through?
I do. One, it's more a question of the scope of each of them. This weighs 1,000 pounds, this microphone. My question is about the scope of the groups. For one thing, reflecting on the slide that have the various sources of emissions, it seems like there's a couple things that are homeless, like waste, which I think was 8%, and I'm wondering what advisory panel would tackle waste. And the housing and energy efficiency doesn't exactly line up with buildings, if it would include all non-housing buildings in that one too. I also had a lot of questions from my members about whether the land use and local government one would be tackling the critical issue of the siting of renewable energy, if that would be included in the scope of that. And then my other question is if members of the council are allowed to listen in on the advisory panel discussions.
Sure. Yeah, let me just provide a couple thoughts, and then maybe John will.
Where's your
add-
microphone?
Oh, here.
Yeah, well, I guess because people in other places. Yeah, taking the mic from you, Ann, you've spoken enough. So, no, it's okay. Okay, thanks, John. So we have considered some of these questions that you raised, and one is on waste. You know, we were thinking about whether there should be another advisory panel. The council can convene another advisory panel. Regardless whether there's another advisory panel or not, we would set up a state agency working group that could provide advice to the council itself in its deliberations. So, you know, the question for the council is, does the council want to have an advisory panel that's composed of outside experts to engage in that process as well, or is the council satisfied with hearing recommendations from staff that they can then debate and act upon in the council deliberations? So that's one point. I think on the question of the scope of the land use and local government panel, whether that would include siting, I think that's a question for the council to determine. The council can direct that panel to consider those issues, or the council can say that's a issue for the power generation advisory panel to work on. So I think that's really a question for all of you. And you know, I think on the third point, and maybe John would want to add more on this, but on the scope of the energy efficiency and housing, I think we did consider that would probably include buildings more broadly. But John, you want to add anything to that? Or Alicia? Did I answer them all?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Is that a little refrigerator for industry and not refrigerants?
It's refrigerants.
It is?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a mini fridge.
Yeah, the 5% is things like hydrofluorocarbons
Okay, that's my
and, you know, coolants and
Hard to
other
find an
such
icon.
Yeah,
chemicals.
right.
We had Donna,
Yes.
and then Rose.
Yeah, I think I had the same question that Ann might have already mentioned, and I was curious if we were, how does the council interact with the advisory panels? And would we be able to listen in potentially for learning purposes on certain panels for which we might have a greater interest?
So, I can take a crack at that one. Yes, I think the answer is yes, there may be that opportunity. I would point out, as our counsel to the council did, which is that if we have, in any case, 12 members of the council present together, that we'd have to recognize and abide by open meetings law requirements in those cases. Again, I think the council who elects the advisory panels has a voice in how those panels will conduct their work. As I alluded to before, I do think it is envisioned that the advisory panels would likely meet more frequently than the council will in order to, frankly, tackle the enormous amount of work that does lie between now and then. I don't believe that would either as to communications with individuals on those advisory panels or potentially certain council members participating in those discussions. And maybe to reiterate again that the advisory panels will be co-chaired by certain members of the council, commissioners for the relevant subject matter areas, our commissioner for housing and transportation and the like. So there will be that ability to have certain levels of interaction. And again, we look to the council as part of the process ahead of voting the advisory panels to provide their views on some of those interactions.
Okay, thank you. Rose?
I'm not suggesting a separate panel, but along the lines of having another advisory group to help the panels, just economic analysis. You know, if we could have some baseline on some of the costs as we look at certain proposals and initiatives. I don't know if it's possible, but, and I don't know how that would play out, but.
Well, I think that topic is required to be considered as part of the ultimate scoping plan that is adopted. So we certainly would anticipate that there would be discussion of that and analysis provided to the council for consideration. Obviously, at our sitting here today at our first meeting, we haven't figured out the exact schedule for all of the work that will play out over the 2 years before the draft scope plan and the 3 years before the final. But again, you know, in response to a couple of comments about the importance of that issue, that absolutely is required to be and will be part of what's presented to the council for adopting the scoping plan.
Right, and all I was suggesting is that maybe a panel member might have a background, so they can help inform as everybody deliberates, or an advisor.
I see, thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, just, you know, the working groups, are we anticipating potentially tapping into our research universities? I know New York is leading in setting these goals, but, you know, at one point Germany was lauded as leading, and also Ontario, Canada, Spain, etc. They put implementation strategies together. There's a lot to be learned from that that could feed into these advisory panels. Has that been considered at all?
Well, listen, I think as the council, we can seek any type of guidance or involvement that we want, right? I mean, we would fully expect to have a thorough engagement with New York's universities on this. We've got Jim Malatras at the table, who wears many hats, but certainly right now is on top of his very nice hair, is wearing a hat as SUNY Empire.
That's very nice of you.
Jim, maybe that's something that you could opine on?
I think, to Rose's point, and I don't think we should do councils, because we have a lot of process. But I think in all of our respective positions, we should bring in the experts as we need to go and facilitate this, so we can get a real actionable item as opposed to more process.
Yeah, less process.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I'll just reiterate a point that I did make before, which is again to say there's the representation on the advisory panels, and then those panels can certainly will have the ability to welcome presentations, Q&A, access to other types of expertise without, again, creating another council.
Advisory council is going to report out, and so I think that's enough for us as a whole. Maybe.
Sure. Good question, though. Yep. Yes, Brian.
Well, it seems that this will be a lot of work for the panels, and it just brings to mind the issue of resources in terms of both analytical resources that I think has been alluded to, and also staff resources. It seems that it would be, you know, I saw the way the advisory group structure, it looks excellent. You got the advisory group, staff, engagement, and that to, you know, ideally that support will be as robust as possible. So I guess I'm interested to know how you guys have thought about resources and level of resources and capacity.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So I didn't recognize all the staff. I mean, there are dozens of staff right now that are working on this that are not even in the room because we couldn't fit them. We wanted to make sure the public could get in, and they will be watching the taping of this afterwards. Anyhow, we intend all of our agencies to fully fully staff this and to meet all of our needs. If we need to, again, as the bylaws envision, formalize staffing for, really for the CAC as secretary and executive director. I mean, those are the things that we envision once this gets off the ground. We're going to need some more firepower, more permanent firepower. And I think that, as agencies, the governor's made clear to us, we've got to carry this out aggressively. And if it means having to dedicate staff to the advisory panels as well to make sure that they're, supporting the various commissioners who are chairing the advisory groups, that's something we will absolutely do. So I think as council members, we should be sensitive to the progress of each of the advisory panels and checking in with them on a regular basis. We're not just giving them a task and then expecting a work product, but in fact, it's a bit of a give and take, and we're setting expectations for them and having a good a sense of management. We'll see whether or not any of the advisory panels are starting to suffer from too much work, and would look to backfill some of those needs, I think, over time. So that's really on all of us.
Thank you.
Peter?
Thanks. I'm not suggesting we add another advisory panel today, but I think we should seriously consider at some point in time convening a communications advisory panel or bringing in outside stakeholders so that we can help understand how to present a lot of this material to the broader public.
Yeah.
I think that's going to just be key. So let's just keep that in the back, that we should probably convene that at some point in time in the future.
That's a good idea. In my remarks in the beginning, I recognize the need to communicate effectively on this. So we're going to get into a lane and get into a very technical lane, science-based. We can't forget that we have to communicate that out and ultimately get public support behind everything that we're doing. So you're right about boosting our resources there. I mean, we've got, great internal resources right now, but the internal resources are also working on press releases and other issues that have nothing to do with the council. So, point well made. So any other questions or comments, thoughts about the advisory panels, or now that we're nearing the end of this, any other thoughts about the CAC in general?
Just a comment. Earlier in the meeting, you had a slide, and I took some notes that said, implement strategies to reduce emissions, we need coordinating amongst agencies, advisory groups, and working groups. But the state agencies, they're all not here. They all do their independent things many times. I don't expect an answer today. I just want to put it on the table. What type of strategies are you talking about? Maybe we can talk about at the next meeting, so that the dormitory authority is not putting out RFPs that are inconsistent with this, or some of the, or even NYSERDA. I'm just throwing out authorities, but state agency work is being done outside of this. But state agency work is being done outside of this room, and they may not be knowledgeable on this. I just was interested to hear what strategies we have in place to make sure the agencies are coordinated.
Okay.
More of a statement than a question and answer today.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we talk about that next time? I mean, I will tell you that we've had a number of cabinet-level meetings about this already, and are doing just that, trying to get all of the commissioners, even those who are not involved specifically, engaged, deputy secretaries as well, assistant secretaries up in the governor's office, and then, certainly there's staffing underneath all the various commissioners. So why don't we have a conversation about that the next time? Makes sense? Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to say it earlier, but also the $3 billion Environmental Bond Act. I just wanted to highlight that it's resiliency and adaptation, but also could be very profound for green infrastructure, and much of what we're working on, and we all talked today about how we want to take action now, not wait for all the regulations. So I just wanted to underline that and any work that we can all do to help pass that.
Great. With the caveat that we can educate the public, we can't advocate for the voters to go to the booth. Just be careful with that. We can talk about getting it through the legislature.
Absolutely.
You can, I can't.
Yes, I can.
Yes.
I was going to say.
You can, Peter, I can.
To
So the
educate.
council is.
I forgot you weren't a commissioner. That's right.
Can I just say a point of clarification, that the last item that you were just addressing to, I think, Gavin's question. So the next meeting will have a little bit of a dialogue or a presentation from the administration on how the agencies are aligning their decision-making to meet those goals. I think it was your slide, Basil, that you had up there that talked about how agencies' decisions are being aligned to meet the goals, so that they're consistent with it. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think we can do this in baby steps, frankly. I think because, we could talk for hours about everything that the state's doing, whether it's just standard development, economic development, or if it's climate specific. I think it would be helpful just for us to give a presentation on the integration of the government effort writ large with what we're doing here, and how there's in some cases a direct line to us, in some cases it's an indirect. But ultimately, we're going to start to turn to you all for those recommendations, right? I mean, we have to keep running the government over the next two years and not wait necessarily for the scoping plan, but how do we set up success? And we'd be welcoming of all ideas on that as we do our business here. If you have any further thoughts about that.
I think
Yeah.
that's.
Okay. So we put up the website here, climate.ny.gov, and an email address, climateact@dec.ny.gov. We'll make sure NYSERDA gets that too. But feel free to, honestly, to check us out. We'll have all the materials up there and all the scheduling up there, and any questions that you all have, please direct to us. I'll talk about quickly what we've already sent out. I hope you all got my email from, I think it was yesterday. Lost track of time here. Yes, yesterday, about the next meeting. We're looking at April 2nd on that. We'd be looking to do that downstate. So we'll get better time and place, location out to you as soon as possible, but if you can begin thinking about April 2nd. My sort of, unapproved draft thinking is that we as a council would meet more aggressively, more frequently, sooner in the year, try to get our business off the ground, and then get the panels staffed up, and begin transitioning some of the burden then to the panels for the second half of the year. Not that we wouldn't continue meeting, but in other words, get our work done now, set up the panels for success, and then have the panels get into a rhythm with the panels when we're beginning to hear some of their work product over time. So we'll solicit all your thoughts on that, on scheduling, and obviously, once we get into the summer, scheduling is difficult, but if we could make some real progress between now and vacation time, whenever that is, August usually, I hear, then we'll get some success. And I think we all share the often repeated remark that we have to get this work done as quickly as possible. So, excellent. Well, again, unless there are any other questions, I want to thank you all for all of your time today, for traveling all this great distance. Thank the public for joining us today, both in this room and in the library. And let's see if we can lead the nation on this. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.